Hi, welcome back to the channel. Today we have a Phenix wristwatch from likely the early 1950s. It's fully round but not ticking, but the hands do set. Phenix is a really interesting brand because they were established kind of early 1870s, and they produced all their own movements up until the 1980s when they ran into financial troubles. Ultimately, the brand was shut down. What's really interesting taking a look at this movement is it has while they made their own movements, they have elements of different other brands. So it's interesting to kind of compare and contrast, elements they either purposely or arrived at independently in this movement, which is kind of a relatively rare one. Just taking off this expanded steel bracelet. It's always interesting to look at the pins on a watch because they're easy and cheap to replace. So if they're in very bad condition, it's probably a sign it's been a while since the watch was serviced. Just using a grippy rubber ball to get the back of the watch off of here. Case back. That ball works surprisingly well for both tightening and loosening watch backs. It's almost as good as a watch back wrench in almost all cases. This is kind of a standard case of the time, a plated case with a stainless steel back. You can see Witt Jewelry engraved there. Brevet means that it's a patent in Switzerland. And removing the stem. Taking the stem off of there and flip the movement over to get it out of the case. Should hopefully come right out. You can see that crystal and how beat up that is. A little bit yellowed as well, so take that out and probably replace that. This case is in pretty rough shape. It's had a lot of the plating worn off, and it's pretty crusty as well. And here I am, because I forgot to set the hands lined up, and this is just to make sure that they're easy to remove with the hand levers. And removing the stem for a second time. Here's two hand levers, just gently taking the hands off. The plastic bag is really just to protect the dial. It's probably not needed, but a little bit of peace of mind. These hands are actually in really good shape. They either were after the kind of radium loom era or have been reloomed at some point in the past. It's kind of hard to tell which. And this box is just a membrane, so you can kind of suspend the hands in between two membranes and make sure they can't rattle around. I show this video in one long cut, but often these watches take me, several weeks to complete. Maybe I take it apart. I need to apart the crystal, for instance, or some other piece, and so often I'm storing the pieces of the watch for quite a while. And this is removing the movement ring. On any modern watch, the movement ring is typically going to be plastic. On these older watches, it's often metal. This one is particularly sticky, and it's hard to tell from this exact top-down angle, but just prying gently to get the movement ring off. And the dial feet screws to get the dial off. Looking back at this footage, I probably would not spend so much time with this dial with the kind of delicate loom on the numbers upside down like that. I'm not sure exactly what I was thinking, but dial comes off nice and easy. It's always good to show kind of places. I try to leave in mistakes. I don't often leave in where I did something wrong for 10 minutes and then undid it, and then redid it, just because this video is already going to be 45 minutes long, but I'll try to mention where I do that, and when it's a mistake that I only did wrong once, leave it in to try to show what not to do just as often as what to do. And remove the cannon pinion. And taking the balance off. One thing that I really disliked about this movement is the guide pins to locate the bridges, both the balance bridge, the trainer wheels bridge, all the bridges. It felt as if the guide pins were kind of maybe shaped in some way. And what I'm trying to say is that when you push the bridge down, it would kind of sink into shape. It was either kind of off or fully on, and it was very hard to be in between. And just taking the tension out of the mainspring here because it came fully wound even though it wasn't ticking. And why that's really annoying with the bridges is that when you're trying to line up pivots, it was very, very delicate where it kind of had to be perfect and then the whole bridge would sink into place and really hold itself there. You couldn't kind of gently press the bridge into place, hold it, adjust the pivot like I typically would do. So this really comes back when I'm putting the balance back on, when I'm putting the train of wheels bridge on. It's really difficult to kind of deal with. And removing the ratchet wheel here. It's a regular direction screw. It usually is on the ratchet wheel. I have had them reverse threaded in the past though, or maybe someone just mixed up the ratchet and crown wheel screws and cranked it in there. It's hard to tell sometimes because I've only had one movement where it was backwards, reverse threaded. And then there's this little tiny bridge that's holding the second hand in. This is this kind of a long pivot through the train wheel bridge to a driving wheel that then drives the second hand is actually something you usually see in chronographs to drive the chronograph, seconds hand that you can stop and start. To be honest, I think this is a pretty inelegant way to do this. Similar movements from the same era kind of figured out a way to avoid having to do the extended pivot with the driving wheel through the bridge like that. And the reason I say it's inelegant is that you have an extra little bridge to hold it, but also those extended pivots through the train wheel bridge are notorious for getting bent. And as I show later on how not to do it, it can be really hard to get the driving wheel off of that pivot and back on it without tweaking the wheel at all and also without bending the pivot at all. So when you're working on chronographs, something that's well known, this is kind of one of the first I've seen of this style. Not working on many chronographs yet these days, so I kind of got a little bit flustered on how to deal with it, but not something that's kind of needed or necessary in order to just drive a center seconds. Took off the click and the click spring there, and here's the ratchet wheel, and here is probably why this watch wasn't running. You can see there's an enormous amount of gunk and buildup under the ratchet wheel. This is likely from someone putting a bunch of oil in the mainspring and it kind of working its way out over time, would be my guess. I don't know why anyone would put that much oil under the ratchet wheel. It's not somewhere you would typically oil at all. I feel like I've seen this on a couple of watches where the mainspring, and maybe this is standard practice at the time, but the mainspring was much more oiled than what you would see today. And you can see here, knowing what I know now, I probably would immediately take off this driving wheel on the top of the train wheel bridge, but here I'm a little bit confused whether that's supposed to come off, whether it should stay on there, and so I'm trying to loosen the train wheel bridge here, which ultimately is not going to work given how these gears are stacked. So give up on that and come back. And again, this is not the right way to take this wheel off. I do it pretty gently with the screwdriver here, but really you should be using something like a Presto hand tool, and they make special ones just for these gears in order to get this off and try to lift it straight off, because you have a very long pivot that's mostly unsupported and it can bend very easily, and then that introduces enough friction to become an issue running the watch. So taking off the train wheel bridge. And then you have this little spring, and that's to kind of hold the center seconds pinion in the right place so that it meshes with that wheel correctly. And taking off the crown wheel. This is reverse threaded, although there's no kind of indication of that. but they almost always are. And taking off the barrel bridge. There's some cuts in here. Typically those cuts are, 10 seconds of nothing on the screen where I'm reaching for a screwdriver or something else. So just again trying to cut out some of the dead space in these videos. 3 screws on the barrel bridge, and then while I'm here, I'll release the setting lever screw, and that'll fall out the bottom. At this point, I haven't really decided whether I want to take that tiny little spring for the center seconds off for the cleaning or not, and then I ultimately decide that it might get damaged if I leave it on. Could get bent, so safer to take it off, even though that screw is microscopic and pretty annoying to deal with. This piece of metal, it's hard to describe. It's like a piece of paper almost. It's just like there's nothing there. You could bend it in half and snap it on accident very easily. And removing the barrel bridge. This isn't that uncommon, but the barrel bridge also covers the center wheel. Sometimes you see the center wheel have its own kind of mini train wheel bridge, if you will. Sometimes it's on the barrel bridge. And when you lift up a bridge like this, you can see I'm struggling with those guide pins from the bridges that I was mentioning. They're very sticky. They kind of suck back in, if you will, which is kind of interesting. But yeah, when you lift up a bridge and 2 elements come with it, it's a pretty good sign that you have some dried up oil. And you can see even more oil on the main plate underneath the barrel, which again makes me think that someone really drenched the mainspring in oil for some reason, and all of that's since dried up. And removing the winding pinion and the sliding clutch, which fell out the bottom. And the third wheel. And the fourth wheel. And the escape wheel. This bridge on the pallet fork you see here is something you might see, I think, on a Rolex movement. And Unitas also uses a bridge like that. So when I mentioned kind of borrowing design features from, and again, I'm not claiming that Phenix copied other features, or maybe they came up with them themselves, but it's interesting to see the similarities between this movement and other movements. Again, this looks a little bit like a Rolex bridge or a Unitas bridge. The kind of driving wheel on top of the train wheel bridge looks like a chronograph. There's just elements of different kind of movements. Again, not necessarily related, maybe kind of confluent design, but interesting to see. And the pallet fork, which is the last piece on this side of the movement. Flipping the movement over. This has an interesting design where it's a combo cover plate clutch lever. It's actually pretty elegant how it's put together here, I think. Often there's a little cover plate that covers the minute wheel and the intermediate wheel, and then the clutch lever covers, basically the spring, maybe interacts with the setting lever, things like that. But this is all kind of one integrated design, which seems to work pretty well. Just a couple screws, and then that cover plate should come right off. If you're ever thinking about getting into this hobby, besides starting with cheap movements, and these all lift right off, I think the one piece of advice that I have is just get very nice tweezers, a couple of different pairs of them, and then different sizes, I should say. You see I use thin ones and a couple thicker pairs as well. And this piece of pegwood is to carefully remove that spring. That spring is kind of one of the more powerful ones on the movement, and it will fly across the room and you'll never see it again. And the lever is, one piece of advice is to get nice tweezers and then treat them just as tweezers. And they don't act as pry levers, they don't act as, cleaning tools or anything like that. All they do is specifically what they're meant for. Being able to practice with and grip small pieces, without gripping them so hard that they shoot out of the tweezers is really important. Here I'm disassembling the barrel, taking out the barrel arbor and the mainspring. Sometimes it's easier just to take the mainspring out and leave the arbor in there until after it's out of the barrel. And I think this is pretty much the standard way to remove a mainspring. There doesn't seem to be any kind of tool or special way to do this besides just carefully walking it out. As you get towards the end, you can shoot the barrel housing away. So as I get to the end here, you see that I kind of pull it out straight, and then can gently push the barrel arbor out of the mainspring. This mainspring is pretty tired. You can kind of tell by the shape and how it's kind of curved in on itself. There's not a lot of life left in that mainspring. A new mainspring will actually recurve into an S shape to give it more power. Here I'm just doing some quick cleanup on the case on just kind of the worst crusted on parts. It just helps it in the ultrasonic to clean it up a little bit beforehand. And these are the pieces of the case back gasket that I found as I was doing this. No life in that left at all. I don't have a very good setup to film my cleaning setup, so here's me putting everything into the cleaning baskets, and then I'll come back when everything's clean, but don't really have a setup to kind of film that and have a background and everything else, and it's kind of a pain to do, frankly, so not much interesting to see in parts getting cleaned anyways. And I was able to find a new mainspring for this movement. So here's installing the new mainspring. They come wrapped up in this little piece of metal to hold them in the correct shape. And to find the correct mainspring, typically I find it's easiest to just Google the movement, and you can find the movement, manufacturer and model number engraved either on one of the bridges or on the main plate. And if you Google the movement, you can typically find the exact measurements of the mainspring you need. And here I am inserting the arbor and closing the lid. And I used my tweezers. Again, these are quite thick tweezers, just to go around the edge and snug that lid into place. A little bit of medium oil where the barrel arbor rubs on the main plate. For metal on metal, typically you use the medium. For metal on jewels, typically you use the light viscosity. And then there's some kind of special cases. Some of the keyless works, where you're interacting with the watch, you use the heavier grease. Inserting the train of wheels. I think I mentioned before that the bridges on this movement are interesting, where they don't kind of slowly go down. They almost like the pegs have some shape to them, so they suck themselves down a little bit. And where that gets really annoying, and I sped this up because it took me so long, is trying to get the train and wheel bridge on and lining up those pivots where they kind of have to be perfect, and you get to push down once, and then the bridge goes all the way down. And if you have any issues, to take the bridge all the way off and try again. So lots of fiddling around to get those all in. and tightening down the train of wheel bridge. Often you'll see that I start by going reverse on the screwdriver until I can feel the first thread engage, and then I tighten it in. Depends on the screw shape. Some screws have a little unthreaded part at the tip that helps it seat in perfectly, and you don't need to do that, and some don't. But often you'll see me go reverse thread until I can, you can't really see it on the video, but until I can feel it seat correctly, and then I'll screw it in. For these tiny, tiny delicate screws, it's a really good way to avoid stripping them. And just putting a little bit of oil on the setting lever screw before the barrel bridge goes on, and the barrel bridge here also holds the center wheel. I kind of like this design actually. It looks pretty nice with the center wheel cut into the barrel bridge. And screwing on the barrel bridge, and you see there where I went reverse for a second, felt it seat, and then tighten the screw. All of these screws, it's hard to describe exactly how tight they are, but they're, snug, but certainly not overly tight. With the size that the screw shaft is, you could easily, with even a small screwdriver, snap the head right off. Inserting the click spring, and then the click. When you first see this, it can be kind of hard to fathom how you know where each piece goes, but for a movement that's relatively simple, a little bit of oil at the top of the barrel too, and then put the ratchet wheel on. And if you get a little bit too much oil, the Watch Co putty is great for taking that off. And here's the ratchet wheel. That's on a square arbor. There's a lot of screws in a movement, but often all the screws for the bridges, both the train of wheel bridge, the barrel bridge, and the crown wheel going on. The barrel bridge, the balance bridge, those are all typically the same screw. This screw for the barrel is quite unique. There's usually two large-headed screws, one for the barrel and one for the crown wheel. Typically one is much longer than the other. The pallet fork bridge will often have its own screw. There'll be a couple screws that are usually pretty easy to tell on the keyless works. They tend to be the smaller screws. So, it can be kind of a little bit confusing what goes where initially, but actually, for most of these designs, a lot of the screws are interchangeable, and the ones that aren't tend to have a pretty obvious spot to go. So here, I would say that I'm assembling this in a slightly out of sync order. So I put the center pinion in its hole, and then I'm assembling the little screw around it. I think if I were to do this movement again, I would screw this little spring on, and then deal with the drive wheel and then the center second pinion. You can see I was using the tweezers to hold the screw while I started it. It was such a small screw that it was very hard to start. This is lining it up with the center seconds pinion, and then just doing a final tighten when it's perfectly aligned. So here's another kind of found out after the fact not to do. If I was going to put this on again, or if I see another one of these in a chronograph or for another type of movement, I would probably use a hand press tool, like you'll see me use later in the video to put the hands back on, to put that on, and that ensures that you're pushing down perfectly level and straight, and really gives you a lot of control over the pressure that you use. Again, that extended pivot goes from the wheel underneath through the jewel and extends out the top, and it's very long, and the end is not supported side to side as much, and so it's really easy to bend. So doing all of that, as you saw me do, both take it off with the screwdriver and put it on the tweezers, it's probably not the smartest way to do this. just checking that it's seated, it's turning with the movement and turning the center seconds pinion. And screwing on that little mini bridge to the center seconds. Next is oiling the jewels. Again, this is probably a jewel I should have oiled before I put that wheel covering it. This movement has the older style cap jewels, I think you would call this a cap jewel, where there's a screw down jewel that covers the pivot here, and it kind of fell off. So this jewel, there's a donut jewel in the bridge still, and then this is a flat jewel that caps it. Something you would typically see in for a balance, but you wouldn't typically see for any of these intermediate wheels, except for on older movements, you would see that. So this needs to be put in some solvent and cleaned, which I've done, and then here's kind of a close-up. You really want to put a dot of oil on this that covers, half the radius, if you will, centered. And this, you can't really tell in this exactly how much oil I put on. The idea is to put a little drop of oil, centered in that jewel, but not all the way to the edge, so that it holds it suspended with surface tension exactly where that pivot's going to touch. When you kind of compare older movements, and again, this is likely from the early 50s, maybe the late 40s, with newer movements, one of the things that stands out is the newer movements are easier to service and have, I think, while there's still things that you can break, they kind of present less opportunities to break them if you're inexperienced or unfamiliar with the movement. Here's putting the canyon pinion on. You can see that I switched to my beefy tweezers to put the cannon pinion on because I don't want to put any sideways pressure on the fine tips of my I shouldn't say nicer tweezers, but my more delicate tweezers. This is just putting a little bit of grease on the keyless works. The, clutch wheel and the sliding clutch. And then this is when you push the crown in to wind versus pull the crown out to set the hands. This slides back and forth and is what determines, by pulling the crown in and out, which action you're performing. Just a little bit of grease on the stem as well, where it meets that sliding clutch and where the setting lever rides on it. Again, the pieces that tend to get the heavier duty grease are the pieces that you tend to interact with. That's kind of a rule of thumb. This is the setting lever, so that's put in place, and then you need to tighten it from the other side in a movement of this kind. You can take a piece of Rodico and stick it down. I find it easiest to grab and move it, hold it with my finger, and then tighten it from the other side. There's no, in a typical movement holder, there isn't really room to leave it in the movement holder and flip the whole thing. So there's no kind of very nice way to do that. And just a little bit more grease on that sliding clutch. And some oil on some of the pivots for the intermediate wheel and minute wheel. And where the lever is going to ride. These intermediate wheels, by the way, often it can be very hard to tell without closely examining them, but often have a top and a bottom. So if you're having issues where the hand isn't setting or isn't winding correctly, the watch isn't winding correctly, it's kind of skipping or it's partially winding but stopping and starting, often that intermediate wheel is the cause, and it's because it's upside down. Here I'm putting a lever on sliding clutch. And then I can kind of, by pushing a little bit of pressure as if the spring was doing it, I can test to make sure that that I have it on the right direction up, that it's engaging with the sliding clutch correctly. Just like taking this spring off the watch, I'm using the pegwood to hold it in place while I put it and pry it into position, just in case anything were to happen. I'd have it. I wouldn't be able to jump away. Now that spring is fully loaded, and put a little bit of grease where it touches the lever, but I want to get the cover plate on as quickly as possible because that spring now has tension and there's nothing really keeping it in place. So if I were to pull the crown out right now or pull it in and out a couple times, there's a good chance that that spring would fly off. The intermediate wheel, the minute wheel, and then the cover plate across all of it. You see one more wheel on the bench up there, and that one is just a slip fit, and so I won't put that on until I'm ready to put the dial on, because there's other things I need to do on the other side of the watch, and it would just fall off. And fitting the cover plate. This can be a little tricky sometimes because it engages with the setting lever, and it's hard to engage it with the setting lever and have it in the right spot to line up the screws. So often you'll kind of put it on top of the setting lever, screw the screws down partially, engage it with the setting lever, and then screw the screws down fully. Here I was kind of able to wedge it in the correct spot that it's supposed to be. You can see I immediately put the first screw in because this is the screw that's holding that spring down. And the second screw. And we're almost complete on the side of the watch. We'll flip it back over, just a close-up view of how it's looking. Pretty intricate movement, I really do like it. Just a couple things left. We have the pallet fork. Pallet fork has its own special oil. There's typically two holes in the main plate, and the idea is that you can set the pallet fork in place and then oil it in place through those two holes. I don't know. I'm sure a professional can do that, or maybe they can do it easily, but I have no idea how I would even attempt that. So I typically stick it in Rodico to hold it, and then oil it there and put it in. And here's the pallet fork bridge. Standard practice is that you would not oil the pallet fork jewels. The pallet fork is so light and it moves so quickly that oil on the pallet fork jewels would actually throw it off. So I don't really know enough of the theory to kind of know the ins and outs, or maybe you oil it on some movements or not. But I was taught that you don't typically oil the pallet fork jewels unless specifically told to for that movement. Movements have oiling guides, by the way, for any modern movement, and most popular older movements. You can actually find a guide that tells you exactly where to oil, how much to oil, and typically they'll even say the specific brand and model number, if you will, of the oil you're supposed to use. But kind of the rules of thumb of light viscosity on jewel pivots, medium viscosity on metal to metal, and then a couple spots where you grease in the keyless works is a pretty good rule of thumb. And again, I kind of cut over it there, but struggling to fit the balance a little bit with the way these bridges work. So I've cut a little bit out here. I was struggling to get the end stone of the kind of jewel placement of the end of the balance out. It was very kind of, I don't know, crusty oil was keeping it in or something, and there's no way to get it out kind of except for with Rodico kind of lifting it out. So I ended up taking the entire balance apart. And I didn't film that because I wasn't sure I was troubleshooting essentially. So I was troubleshooting and didn't want to film an hour of me troubleshooting, but I ended up taking the entire balance apart, and unfortunately didn't film that, but I can film how I put it back together. So there's a small stud on the end of the balance spring, the hairspring, and that you can see me pushing that into the hole, and then there's a screw that hits the stud from the side, and I'm have the bridge stuck down to some Rodico. I'm kind of supporting it with my finger. That my finger's not kind of on the balance itself. It's really just on the bridge, and then I'm screwing in the screw from the side that holds the hairspring stud. And setting up and adjusting a balance and everything else is a whole art form of itself. Here you can see I'm kind of hooking it over the timing stud, and then tightening the timing stud on that. I'm by no means an expert, and frankly, probably more of an amateur than anything else at balances. But um, if all you're doing is taking it apart, cleaning it, and putting it back together, as long as you don't bend the hairspring or mess it up in any way, you you don't have to. You can skip a lot of the steps around timing and making sure the beat error is correct and all of that kind of stuff that is really an art form to kind of get perfect on a watch. So here I am again struggling with the bridges on this watch. You can see I put it in place, it kind of sucked down. I have to get the screwdriver out to lift it, and I'm not sure if I show you all my struggles here, but certainly a couple attempts in order to get the balance seated correctly, spinning correctly in the watch. I'm checking it as I go to make sure it's spinning. A little bit of air, and there it goes, perfect. So now I have the balance back in. I still need to clean the jewel and the jewel setting. So I've cleaned them, and again, really can't see from this angle. Maybe someday I'll get a microscope, but just a little dot of oil, covering half the surface, and that oil holds the cap jewel and the jewel setting together just by kind of surface tension, and then that is dropped on top of the balance. And then there's a little brass spring that folds over and locks the jewel in place. And that not only holds it in place, makes it easier to service, but this is called an Inca block. And there's various types of shock settings, especially in modern ones, but this is kind of the original, where this was the original shock setting. So if you dropped your watch, it wouldn't break that jewel, which is quite hard to replace or fix. That'd be a fairly major repair. Instead, it would flex just enough, and it doesn't really look like a spring in the traditional sense, but it would flex just enough so you wouldn't break the balance staff or crack the jewel, which is a pretty big revelation at the time. Back over to the other side. I don't think I showed it, but did all the necessary oiling on this side as well for the all the pivots and the balance and everything else. And we're really on the home stretch here, so putting the dial back on the watch, gently falling into place, and tightening the dial feet screws from the side. When cleaning the watch, it's typically acceptable to leave the dial feet screws in, which is why you didn't see them in the parts. Here are the hands. I haven't done anything to the hands. They're in pretty good shape. I just took them off, kept them safe, and put them back on. And here's the hand press tool. The hour hand, you can really put the hour hand on at any position. I tend to put it on at 12 for whatever reason, just gently pressing that into place. This is the tool, by the way, that on that driving wheel on the top of the train of wheel bridge is really what I should have used. So I'm going to spin this and make sure there's clearance under it. It's not going to hit anywhere on the dial. And then I'll line it up directly with the 12 so that I can put the minute hand on in the right position. You can put the minute hand on in any kind of, quote, valid position. So you could really put the hour hand on any hour and the minute hand on a 12, and that would be fine. It's obviously, it's just easier to kind of start both vertical 12-12, make sure they're lining up perfectly. But you could put the minute hand on at any position as long as it corresponds correctly to the hour hand. And finally, the seconds hand. It's nice to put the seconds hand when the watch is wound and running because it makes it a lot easier to tell. You may not have noticed there, but I use my thumb to steady the tweezers as I put that on. A very, very handy tip for more delicate operations. Use the tweezers with one hand and then use another finger braced on the mat in order to brace the tweezer tips. And here again, I'm checking the tolerance, making sure none of the hands are going to hit each other, and putting the movement ring back on. And just great filming going on here. Hopefully you get to see at least a little bit of what I'm working on. Movement ring back on. And I showed the original glass at the beginning. Yeah, here it is again. It's just pretty beat up. And a watch glass like this, I think this probably cost me somewhere in the neighborhood of $3 to $5. So for these old watches that have the kind of standard acrylic watch glasses, it's just a really cheap piece to replace. And for the look of the watch is maybe the biggest change that you can make, or the best bang for your buck in a new parts you can do for the watch. So almost always worth it to replace the crystal unless it truly is in kind of perfect condition, or it's a unique crystal that's hard to find. Maybe it's square, maybe it's an underlip design, something like that. This is called a crystal lift. So you hold the crystal in the quote unquote vise, and then that lets the crystal lift line up perfectly so that you're grabbing just above the bottom of the crystal. And this tightens down, bends the crystal so that it's kind of a smaller diameter, and then you can put it in place and let the tension off, and it will expand and hold itself in the rim of the case. There's various ways to remove and replace crystals. This is a pretty popular way. You can also use a press system, like a Rober press, to bend the crystal that way and put the case on, from the bottom. So there's various ways to insert crystals, but this happens to be one that doesn't require its own dedicated press, which is nice. And it's easy as that. This is probably my least favorite part of working on watches. The crystal's in, but you'll see any speck of dust in that crystal when it's on your wrist. So I'm going to spend the next probably 20 minutes with Rodico, with the air blower, holding the crystal up to the light, chasing down any kind of speck, any kind of finger grease, anything that's on the inside of that crystal and the outside, just so I can actually see. And then here it is. I've cleaned it, I put it on, and we're ready to case the watch. So just one last view at that beautiful little movement. Tightening the setting lever screw. And just put a dust cover on that while I work on the case back. I showed the original gasket that was on the case back as it disintegrated into a couple pieces. So this is a new gasket. I just got a set of gaskets and picked the right size. And this is just to put a little bit of grease on it helps with the water tightness. It also helps kind of with the feel of putting the case back on. Keeps the gasket from getting bunched up as well. By the way, if you're interested in watch parts or watchmaking or want to take, give this a try, um, the watch glass, these, watch replacement watch gasket, that uh, the grease applicator that you just saw, most of the tools that I have, I get them all from Cousins UK. It's a watch supply company. I have no affiliation, no kind of affiliate links or anything like that. But if you are interested in it, I've tried several different sites, and they just have an amazing selection, great prices. Somehow they're based in the UK, but they ship to the US cheaper than US sites do. So can't recommend them highly enough. It's where I get the new mainspring as well. So they have all sorts of watch parts, tools, and kind of everything you'd need from beginner all the way up to uh, quite kind of professional grade tools. And here's the watch back going on. This watch is probably originally was kind of waterproof, a little bit water resistant maybe. I think with age, the fact that there's not a screw down crown. There's a crown gasket, but just a little gasket in there. I wouldn't really call this waterproof, and so certainly no need to crank the case back on as tight as possible. But that's the completed watch. I'll adjust the light here just so you can get a better look at it. A very cool little brand, makes their own movements. A lot of kind of design cues on the movement from other brands, but very cool to see independent movement maker. And here's what it looks like on the strap on the wrist. Smaller form factor, but looks amazing. If you made it this far, I really appreciate you taking the time to listen to me. I'm by no means an expert, but you know, happy to kind of show what I'm up to, and appreciate watching others do videos on YouTube. So thought I would do the same. Thanks, everyone.